These documents confirm the paternity test, Mr. Harrison, and this letter is his confession.
Some secrets don't stay buried forever. The words were barely above a whisper, but the moment Maya Brooks heard them behind the ballroom doors, something cold slid through her chest. Inside the Grand Crescent Hotel, the annual Whitmore Foundation Gala shimmered beneath towering crystal chandeliers worth more than most families' homes. Men in tailored tuxedos moved through the gold-lit ballroom with glasses of $100 champagne in their hands, while a string quartet played softly near the marble staircase. Every inch of the room smelled like wealth, polished wood, expensive perfume, and old power. Maya lowered her eyes and adjusted the silver tray balanced carefully against her palm. Her black server uniform fit perfectly, pressed clean despite being nearly 3 years old. She moved quietly between tables the way people like her always learned to do in places like this. Invisible, but necessary. "Champagne, ma'am," she asked gently to a woman wearing enough diamonds to blind someone under direct light. The woman took a glass without looking at her. Maya was used to that. 8 months working at the Grand Crescent had taught her exactly how the wealthy preferred their staff. Silent, fast, forgettable. Still, tonight felt different. Her pulse wouldn't settle. The folded envelope hidden inside her apron pocket seemed heavier with every passing minute. Across the ballroom, cameras flashed as Richard Whitmore stepped onto the stage beneath a giant glowing banner that read "Hope Changes Lives." The billionaire smiled with practiced warmth while hundreds of guests applauded him. White hair perfectly combed, navy tuxedo tailored within an inch of perfection. The kind of man magazines called inspiring because they never looked close enough to see the cracks. "Tonight," Richard announced into the microphone, his deep voice echoing through the ballroom, "we celebrate compassion, generosity, and the responsibility we have to lift others up." The crowd applauded again. Maya's fingers tightened around the tray so hard the metal edge dug into her skin. Compassion, generosity. The words almost made her laugh. Almost. She remembered her grandmother sitting beside a flickering space heater in their tiny apartment 3 nights earlier, wrapping a blanket tighter around her shoulders because the heat had been shut off again. She remembered the hospital bills stacked on the kitchen counter. She remembered the envelope that arrived 2 weeks ago with no return address, containing only an old photograph and a handwritten note that changed everything. Maya had replayed that moment in her head at least 100 times. Maybe she should have thrown it away. Maybe she should have stayed home tonight. But then Richard Whitmore's eyes lifted from the crowd and landed directly on her. The smile disappeared from his face instantly. Maya felt the air shift before anyone else noticed. Richard stopped speaking mid-sentence. His jaw tightened. For one strange second, he looked terrified. Not annoyed, not confused, terrified. The ballroom slowly fell silent as Richard stared at the young black maid standing near table 12 holding a tray of champagne. One of the investors near the stage leaned toward another guest and whispered, "What's wrong with him?" Richard swallowed hard, then stepped away from the microphone. "Security," he said coldly, his voice cutting through the silence like shattered glass. "Remove her from this gala immediately." Gasps rippled across the room. 2 security guards turned toward Maya at once. Nearby guests twisted in their chairs to look at her, curiosity spreading across their faces like wildfire. Maya didn't move. The music stopped completely now. Even the violinists froze. The first guard approached carefully. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us." Maya looked past him, straight at Richard Whitmore standing beneath the golden lights. His face had gone pale enough to erase every ounce of confidence he wore seconds earlier. Slowly, carefully, Maya reached into her apron pocket and touched the edge of the old envelope hidden inside. Then she spoke the 7 words that made the billionaire's entire body go still. "Tell Mr. Whitmore I found my father's letter." The moment the words left Maya's mouth, the entire ballroom seemed to lose its air. Richard Whitmore stood frozen beneath the stage lights, one hand still gripping the microphone, while the other tightened around his champagne glass, so hard his knuckles turned pale beneath the golden glow. The guests sensed it immediately. Wealthy people were experts at reading power. and for the first time all night, the billionaire no longer looked in control. The two security guards exchanged uncertain glances beside Maya. One of them loosened his grip slightly. "Sir?" the older guard asked carefully, waiting for instructions. Richard did not answer right away. His eyes stayed locked on Maya, as if seeing a ghost standing in the middle of the ballroom. The orchestra remained silent in the corner. Even the soft clink of silverware had stopped. Maya could feel hundreds of eyes crawling across her uniform, her dark skin, the silver tray trembling faintly in her hands. Some guests looked irritated at the interruption. Others looked curious. A few looked uncomfortable, like they had just realized the room was not as safe and polished as it appeared 5 minutes earlier. Richard finally stepped down from the stage. Slowly, carefully, every polished dress shoe against the marble floor echoed through the silence. "What did you say?" he asked quietly. Maya swallowed once before answering. "I said I found my father's letter." Richard's jaw tightened. "That is impossible." His voice came out sharper now, colder, but Maya noticed something beneath it. Fear. Real fear. She had seen it before. In hospital waiting rooms. In overdue eviction notices. In the eyes of people seconds before terrible truths reached them. Maya lowered the tray onto a nearby table before her hands could shake too much. "It was hidden inside an old storage box my grandmother kept after he died," she said softly. "I think you know exactly which letter I mean." A woman in a diamond necklace leaned toward her husband and whispered loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "Who is this girl?" Another man frowned. "Did she say her father?" The murmurs spread fast now, moving through the ballroom like wind through dry leaves. Richard glanced around at the growing attention, then forced a tight smile toward the guests. "Ladies and gentlemen, please enjoy your evening. There has been a misunderstanding involving a staff member." Staff member. Maya almost smiled at the way the words sounded now. Smaller. Weaker. Like Richard himself did not believe them anymore. "A misunderstanding?" Maya asked calmly. "My father spent 20 years protecting your reputation. I would not call that a misunderstanding." The room reacted instantly. Several people turned fully in their seats now. Phones appeared quietly in hands beneath the tables. Someone near the back began recording. Richard noticed. His face darkened for a split second before the polished public mask returned. "Enough," he said. "You do not understand what you are talking about." Maya reached slowly into her apron pocket and pulled out the old envelope. Time had yellowed the edges. The paper looked fragile beneath the chandelier light. Across the front, written in faded blue ink, was one name. Richard Whitmore. The billionaire stopped breathing for half a second. Maya saw it happen. Saw the exact instant the confidence drained from his face. An older guest near the stage stood abruptly from his chair, squinting toward the envelope. "Good Lord," the man whispered. "Daniel Brooks." Maya turned toward the voice. The elderly man looked stunned, like someone who had seen the past walk directly into the room. "You knew my father?" she asked quietly. The man nodded slowly without taking his eyes off the envelope. "Everybody knew Daniel," he said. "At least, we used to." Richard stepped forward immediately. "That is enough," he snapped, louder this time. "Give me the letter." But Maya did not move. Instead, she looked directly into his eyes beneath the glittering ballroom lights and asked the question she had waited her entire life to ask. "Why did my father disappear the same week your foundation became worth $200 million? The question hit the ballroom harder than any scream could have. Nobody moved. Nobody even reached for a champagne glass anymore. The only sound left inside the Grand Crescent Hotel was the soft hum of the air conditioning drifting through the crystal chandeliers overhead. Richard Whitmore stared at Maya as if the floor beneath him had started cracking apart inch by inch. The billionaire opened his mouth once, then closed it again. For the first time all night, he had no speech prepared, no polished smile, no perfect answer. Maya could feel her heartbeat against the old envelope resting in her hands. 20 years of silence suddenly stood in the middle of the ballroom, wearing a black server uniform and sensible shoes from a discount store. A younger woman near the front table whispered, "Who is Daniel Brooks?" The elderly man who recognized the name slowly lowered himself back into his chair, his face pale beneath the golden lighting. "Daniel built the Whitmore Foundation with him," he said quietly. Several nearby guests turned immediately. "What?" somebody asked. The older man swallowed hard before continuing. "Before Richard became famous, Before the magazine covers and political donations, there were two young men running that company out of a rented office above a laundromat in Brooklyn. Richard Whitmore and Daniel Brooks. Maya watched shock ripple through the room. One guest looked back at Richard in disbelief. Another quietly lowered her phone, suddenly unsure whether she should keep recording. Richard finally found his voice again. "Arthur," he warned sharply. "That is enough." But the old man ignored him. "Daniel was brilliant," Arthur continued softly. "Smartest financial mind I ever met. Everybody knew it. But one day he vanished, and Richard told us he moved overseas after a disagreement." Arthur looked toward Maya now, his expression heavy with regret. "I never questioned it. None of us did." Maya's fingers tightened around the envelope. She remembered her grandmother telling her stories late at night while rain tapped against their apartment windows. Stories about a father she barely remembered. A man who loved jazz records, peppermint tea, and fixing broken radios with her at the kitchen table. A man who promised her he would always come home. Then one day he never did. Richard stepped closer now, lowering his voice. "Maya, this is neither the place nor the time." Maya almost laughed at the absurdity of those words. Neither the place nor the time. Beneath a giant banner about hope and honesty. In a ballroom full of people donating millions for public applause. "You are right," she said calmly. 20 years ago would have been a better time." Several guests shifted uncomfortably. Richard glanced around the room, noticing every eye fixed on him now. The billionaire who controlled senators, investors, and entire news cycles suddenly looked trapped inside his own gala. Maya carefully opened the envelope. The paper inside crackled softly beneath her fingertips. Richard's face changed instantly. "Do not read that here," he said quickly. Too quickly. Maya noticed the panic before anyone else did. So did the crowd. "Why not?" she asked quietly. Richard took another step forward. "Because you do not understand the full story." Maya lifted her eyes slowly. "Then tell them." Silence. Long, heavy. The kind of silence that exposes people more completely than words ever can. Richard looked around the ballroom as though searching for an escape route hidden somewhere between the marble columns and gold curtains. But there was none. Maya unfolded the letter carefully. The handwriting inside was faded but steady. Her father's handwriting. The same looping letters she remembered from old birthday cards kept hidden in her dresser drawer for years. She drew one slow breath before reading aloud. "If anything happens to me, Richard knows the truth about the money." Gasps spread instantly across the room. Someone dropped a fork near the back table. The sharp metallic sound echoed across the ballroom floor. Richard closed his eyes briefly, like a man hearing the past return to collect a debt. Richard Whitmore opened his eyes slowly, but the billionaire standing beneath the chandeliers no longer looked untouchable. The room could feel it now. Wealth had a smell, a rhythm, a confidence people followed without question, and for the first time that evening, Richard's certainty had cracked wide open in front of everyone. Maya held the letter carefully in both hands as though it carried something fragile enough to break all over again. Around her, whispers spread table to table like wildfire moving through dry grass. Investors leaned toward senators. Socialites stared over diamond-covered shoulders. Waiters stood frozen beside half-filled wine glasses, afraid to move. The gala had transformed from celebration into something colder, something dangerous. Richard loosened the collar of his tuxedo slightly. "Daniel wrote many things when he was under pressure," he said carefully. "He was confused during that period of his life." Maya stared at him in disbelief. "Confused?" she repeated softly. "That is the word you are choosing?" Richard glanced toward the guests before lowering his voice. "Maya, your father was my friend. Then why did he die alone while you built an empire using his work?" The question landed hard enough to silence the remaining whispers nearby. Arthur slowly removed his glasses and rubbed a shaking hand across his face. "Richard," the old man said quietly, "please tell me this is not what I think it is." Richard ignored him completely. Maya noticed the sweat beginning to gather near the billionaire's temples despite the cool ballroom air. He looked like a man trying to hold a collapsing wall upright with his bare hands. "Read the rest." A woman near the back suddenly called out. Heads turned instantly. The woman looked nervous after speaking, but she did not look away. "If there is more in the letter," she continued quietly, "then let her read it." Several others nodded now. Richard saw it happening. The shift. 20 minutes earlier, every person in the ballroom would have defended him automatically. Now they wanted answers. Maya unfolded the second page slowly. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear anymore, but from the weight of hearing her father's voice again after so many years. The paper smelled faintly old, like dust and cedarwood from her grandmother's closet. She swallowed once before reading. If Richard ever tells the world I abandoned my family, know that it was a lie. A sharp breath escaped somewhere near the front tables. Maya kept reading. I found transfers hidden inside the foundation accounts. Millions moved through fake charities. When I threatened to report it, Richard begged me to stay quiet until he could fix it. Richard stepped forward instantly. That is enough. His voice cracked this time. Actually cracked. Maya looked up slowly. You said he was confused, she whispered. This sounds very clear to me. Richard's polished mask began slipping completely now. You do not understand how different things were back then, he said quickly. We were young. We made mistakes. The company was collapsing. Investors would have destroyed us. Maya's eyes narrowed. So my father paid the price instead? Richard looked genuinely shaken now. I never wanted Daniel hurt. The ballroom reacted immediately to that sentence. Hurt. Not gone. Not disappeared. Hurt. Maya noticed it too. So did Arthur. The old man slowly stood from his chair again, staring directly at Richard. What exactly happened to Daniel? Arthur asked. Nobody moved. Nobody even blinked. Richard's breathing grew uneven beneath the bright ballroom lights. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, rain had started falling over Manhattan, streaking the glass in silver lines. Maya could hear it faintly beneath the silence. Richard looked toward the windows for a moment, like a man searching 20 years backward through the rain. Then finally, quietly, almost too quietly to hear, he said the words that changed the entire room forever. Daniel was never supposed to disappear. The confession hung over the ballroom like smoke after a fire. Nobody spoke. Nobody even shifted in their seats. Rain continued sliding down the massive glass windows behind Richard Whitmore, turning the Manhattan skyline into a blur of silver lights and shadows. Maya felt her throat tighten as she stared at the billionaire standing only a few feet away from her. 20 years of questions suddenly felt painfully close to answers she was not sure she wanted to hear. Richard slowly lowered his head, the bright chandelier light catching the gray in his hair. Daniel found things he was never supposed to find, he said quietly. His voice no longer sounded polished or powerful. It sounded tired. Old. Back then the foundation was struggling. Investors were pulling out. We were desperate to survive. Maya folded the letter carefully in her hands. So you stole money through fake charities. Richard closed his eyes. Briefly, I moved money to protect the company. That is not the same thing. The words came sharper than Maya intended, but she did not regret them. Around the ballroom, guests exchanged uneasy glances. Some looked angry now. Others looked embarrassed, as though they were realizing they had spent years applauding a lie while people like Maya cleaned their tables in silence. Arthur stepped closer slowly. Richard, he said carefully, did Daniel threaten to expose you? Richard looked at him for a long moment before nodding once. The answer spread through the room instantly, without another word needing to be spoken. Maya felt something heavy settle inside her chest. Her father had not abandoned them. He had tried to do the right thing. And somehow, that choice had cost him everything. He gave me 1 week, Richard admitted quietly. 1 week to confess before he went to the authorities. Maya's breathing slowed. And then, Richard swallowed hard. And then he disappeared. The ballroom remained perfectly still. Somewhere near the back of the room, a woman quietly began crying into a napkin. Maya noticed Richard avoiding her eyes now. The billionaire who had commanded senators and CEOs minutes earlier suddenly looked incapable of meeting the gaze of one black maid standing in front of him. You told the world he ran away? Maya whispered. Richard nodded faintly. I told myself it was temporary at first. I thought Daniel would come back after he calmed down. Maya stared at him in disbelief. You let my grandmother search for him for years. Richard's shoulders sagged beneath the expensive tuxedo. I know. You let my mother die believing he abandoned us. Another silence. This one worse than before. Richard's face tightened painfully, but he did not deny it. Maya could hear her own heartbeat now. Every memory from childhood came rushing back at once. Her mother staring out apartment windows late at night. Unpaid bills stacked beside family photographs. Birthdays with one empty chair nobody talked about anymore. Do you know what hurts the most? Maya asked softly. Richard finally looked up. Her eyes glistened beneath the ballroom lights, but her voice stayed calm. It is not the money. It is not even the lies. She took one slow breath. It is the fact that you stood on this stage tonight talking about compassion while the family my father died protecting could barely keep the lights on. Several guests lowered their eyes. Nobody defended Richard now. Nobody even tried. The billionaire looked around the ballroom slowly, finally understanding the full weight of what had happened. The empire he spent decades building was collapsing in complete silence. No shouting. No scandalous headlines yet. Just truth moving from one person to another beneath crystal chandeliers and soft golden light. Then Maya reached into the envelope again and pulled out a second folded paper. Smaller. Older. Richard saw it and instantly lost what little color remained in his face. No, he whispered under his breath. Maya unfolded the page carefully. What is this? Arthur asked quietly. Maya looked directly at Richard before answering. It is the receipt for the private investigator my father hired 3 days before he vanished. She lowered her eyes toward the faded paper. And according to this, she said softly, the investigator met with Richard Whitmore the night before my father disappeared forever. Richard Whitmore stared at the faded receipt in Maya's hand, as though the paper itself had reached across 20 years to drag him backward into a life he had spent decades trying to bury. Rain tapped steadily against the towering ballroom windows now, soft but relentless, the sound wrapping around the silence like a clock slowly counting down. Nobody touched their food anymore. Plates sat untouched beneath golden candlelight, while the smell of expensive steak and wine drifted uselessly through the room. Maya looked down at the receipt again. The ink had faded badly over time, but one line remained painfully clear. Meeting confirmed. Richard Whitmore requested private consultation regarding Daniel Brooks' investigation. Date, October 14th. 3 days before her father vanished. Maya remembered sitting on her grandmother's living room floor 2 weeks earlier while dust floated through the late afternoon sunlight. The old storage box had been hidden behind winter blankets inside the closet for years. At first she almost ignored it. Then she found the letters, the receipts, the photograph. Piece by piece, her father's silence began turning into a story. Richard finally stepped closer again, though much slower this time. Maya, he said quietly, your father hired that investigator because he thought people inside the company were watching him. Maya lifted her eyes carefully. Were they? Richard hesitated too long. The answer settled over the ballroom before he even spoke. Arthur exhaled heavily beside one of the tables. Dear God, the old man whispered. Maya could see guests looking at Richard differently now. Not like a billionaire. Not like a philanthropist. Just a man. A frightened man who had spent years hiding behind polished speeches and charitable foundations, while another family lived with unanswered grief. What happened after that meeting? Maya asked softly. Richard's gaze drifted toward the rain outside. The investigator told me Daniel had already copied financial records, he admitted. He planned to go public if I refused to confess. Maya folded her arms tightly across herself, suddenly cold despite the warm ballroom air. So you stopped him? No, Richard answered immediately. Too quickly. I swear to you, Maya, I never wanted Daniel harmed. Maya noticed something shift in his voice then. Not manipulation. Not arrogance. Regret. Deep enough to hollow a person out from the inside. Richard rubbed a trembling hand across his face before continuing. I met Daniel that night in a parking garage downtown. I begged him not to destroy everything we built. Maya could almost picture it. 2 young men standing beneath fluorescent lights 20 years earlier while rainwater pooled around concrete pillars outside. One desperate to expose the truth. The other desperate to survive it. Did he listen? She asked. Richard shook his head slowly. Daniel said something I never forgot. His voice dropped almost to a whisper now. He told me that success built on silence eventually poisons everyone around it. The room stayed completely still. Maya felt tears sting behind her eyes, but forced herself not to look away. Her father had known exactly who Richard truly was long before the rest of the world ever did. Then what happened? Arthur asked quietly. Richard swallowed hard. Daniel walked away from me that night. Another pause. Longer this time. It was the last time I ever saw him. The ballroom lights reflected faintly off Maya's eyes as she studied Richard's face for any sign of dishonesty. But what she saw instead looked worse. Shame. The kind that sits inside someone for so long it becomes part of their bones. You expect me to believe you just let him disappear? Maya asked softly. Richard looked down at the marble floor beneath his polished shoes. No, he admitted quietly. I do not expect you to believe anything I say anymore. Somewhere near the entrance doors, one of the hotel staff quietly turned off the background music system completely. The ballroom fell into a deeper silence than before. No violin, no conversation, only rain against glass and the distant hum of Manhattan traffic 30 floors below. Then a new voice suddenly broke through the stillness. Because he is leaving out the most important part. Heads turned instantly toward the ballroom entrance. A tall woman in a gray wool coat stood there dripping rainwater onto the marble floor, her silver hair damp around her face. Maya did not recognize her, but Richard Whitmore did. The billionaire's expression collapsed the second he saw her. Helen, he whispered in shock. The woman stepped slowly into the ballroom, holding an old leather folder tightly against her chest. You told them Daniel disappeared, she said coldly. But you forgot to mention who convinced him to meet that investigator in the first place. The woman in the gray coat stepped fully into the ballroom, and the energy inside the room shifted instantly again. Rainwater glistened on the shoulders of her coat beneath the chandelier light, while every guest turned toward her with the same stunned silence that had followed Maya all night. Richard Whitmore looked as though someone had drained the remaining strength from his body. Helen, he repeated quietly, almost unable to believe she was standing there. Maya studied the stranger carefully. The woman appeared to be somewhere in her late 60s, elegant despite the rain, with sharp eyes that carried the exhaustion of someone who had spent years holding onto painful truths. The leather folder pressed against her chest looked worn at the corners, old enough to matter. You know her? Maya asked softly. Richard did not answer. Helen did instead. I was your father's attorney, she said, her voice calm but firm. Maya's breath caught immediately. The ballroom reacted with another wave of whispers. Attorney, someone murmured near the back. Helen nodded slowly while keeping her eyes on Richard. Daniel hired me 2 months before he disappeared. He knew something was wrong inside the foundation accounts, and he was terrified. Richard stepped forward quickly. Helen, do not do this here. Do not do what? She asked coldly. Tell the truth in the same ballroom where you spent 20 years pretending to be a savior. Several guests lowered their eyes. Nobody interrupted her. Nobody defended Richard anymore. Maya felt her pulse pounding harder now. Every answer seemed to uncover something worse beneath it. Helen carefully opened the leather folder and removed several yellow documents. Your father was preparing to testify, she told Maya gently. Not against strangers. Against Richard. Maya stared at the papers in disbelief. Richard closed his eyes briefly, as though hearing the words spoken aloud hurt more than he expected. Daniel believed the foundation could still be saved, Helen continued. He wanted the stolen money returned quietly before federal investigators became involved. Arthur looked visibly shaken now. My God, he whispered. We all celebrated the foundation while this was happening underneath us. Helen turned toward him sadly. Because Richard made sure nobody looked close enough. Richard suddenly straightened, the old authority briefly returning to his voice. I already admitted I made mistakes. Mistakes, Helen repeated sharply. Daniel lost his career, his reputation, and eventually his life, while you became the face of American philanthropy. The words landed across the ballroom like thunder. Maya felt tears threatening again, but she stayed still. Calm. Her father deserved calm, not chaos. What happened after the parking garage meeting? She asked quietly. Helen hesitated for the first time. Rain tapped harder against the windows now, the city lights outside smearing across the glass like watercolor. Daniel called me that night, Helen said softly. He sounded exhausted, defeated, but he also sounded relieved. Maya frowned slightly. Relieved? Helen nodded. He said Richard promised to cooperate. He believed they could fix everything together. Maya slowly turned toward Richard. The billionaire could not meet her eyes anymore. You lied to him, she whispered. Richard's face tightened painfully. No, he said quietly. At least, not at first. Helen looked at him with open disgust now. Tell her the rest. Richard swallowed hard. The ballroom had become so silent Maya could hear the rainwater dripping from Helen's coat onto the marble floor. The next morning, Richard admitted slowly. Daniel was supposed to meet federal investigators with copies of the financial records. Maya held her breath. Richard's voice weakened further, but the files were gone. A stunned murmur spread instantly across the room. Helen nodded grimly. Every document vanished overnight. Bank transfers, internal ledgers, everything. Maya stared at Richard in disbelief. Did you destroy them? Richard looked shattered now. No, then who did? Richard finally lifted his eyes toward Maya again, and for the first time that night, the billionaire looked genuinely afraid. Someone inside the foundation found out Daniel was talking, he whispered. And 2 days later, your father disappeared before he could testify. The rain outside the ballroom windows grew heavier, streaking the glass in long silver lines that blurred the city beyond into nothing but distant lights and shadows. Inside the Grand Crescent Hotel, nobody seemed to remember this night had started as a celebration. The untouched meals had gone cold. Candles burned lower across the tables. Every eye remained fixed on Maya Brooks, the black maid who had walked into the gala carrying a silver tray and somehow uncovered. 20 years of buried truth before dessert had even been served. Maya stood perfectly still beneath the chandelier light, her father's letter pressed gently against her chest. Someone inside the foundation, she repeated quietly. You know who it was, do not you? Richard Whitmore looked exhausted now. Not rich, not powerful, just tired in a way that seemed older than his years. He loosened his tie slowly, almost absent-mindedly, while the room waited for his answer. I suspected, he admitted carefully, but I could never prove it. Helen's expression hardened immediately. That is not true. Richard looked toward her sharply. Helen, you knew exactly who ordered the records destroyed, she said coldly. Maya watched panic flash across Richard's face for the second time that night. A few guests leaned forward in their chairs. The silence inside the ballroom became unbearable again. Who? Maya asked softly. Helen hesitated before answering. Charles Mercer. The name moved through the room instantly. Several investors exchanged stunned looks. One woman near the front table covered her mouth in disbelief. Maya frowned slightly. The former board chairman? Helen nodded. Charles controlled the financial side of the foundation back then. When Daniel discovered the fake charities, Charles panicked. He believed exposure would destroy everyone connected to the company. Richard lowered his eyes toward the marble floor. I tried to stop him. Maya's voice remained calm. But you did not. Richard closed his eyes briefly. No, the honesty hurt more than excuses ever could. Maya suddenly understood something then. Richard Whitmore had spent 20 years pretending he was protecting his empire, but in reality, he had been protecting himself from guilt. Every scholarship, every speech, every smiling photograph beside hospital patients and struggling families. None of it had silenced what happened to Daniel Brooks. Why did you never tell us? Maya asked quietly. Because I was ashamed, Richard admitted immediately. His voice cracked slightly beneath the final word. Your grandmother came to my office once after Daniel disappeared. She begged me for answers. Maya felt. Her chest tightened painfully. Richard swallowed hard before continuing. I looked her in the eyes and told her Daniel chose to leave. Several guests lowered their heads. Even Helen looked away for a moment. She cried in my office for almost an hour, Richard whispered. And I let her walk out believing the man she loved abandoned her family. Maya's eyes filled instantly, but she refused to let the tears fall. Not here. Not in front of all these people who had spent years overlooking women like her, unless they were carrying trays or cleaning floors. Richard looked directly at her now. I wanted to tell the truth more times than you can imagine. Maya shook her head slowly. But you loved your reputation more. Richard did not argue. That silence answered everything. The rain hammered harder against the windows now, deep and steady like distant applause from another world. Somewhere near the back tables, one of the younger hotel servers quietly removed her uniform jacket and draped it over Maya's shoulders without saying a word. Maya looked surprised for a second before softly whispering thank you. It was such a small gesture, but it changed something in the room. Guests noticed it too. The invisible people inside the ballroom had started seeing each other. Helen slowly stepped closer beside Maya. There is one more thing, she said gently. Maya looked toward her. Helen opened the leather folder again and removed a final document sealed inside clear plastic. Your father prepared this the night before he disappeared, she explained. He wanted it delivered to your family if anything happened to him. Maya carefully accepted the paper with trembling hands. Across the top, typed in faded black letters, were words that made Richard Whitmore visibly break apart where he stood. Transfer of ownership agreement. Maya's eyes widened slowly as she read the signature line underneath. Daniel Brooks. 50% founding ownership of Whitmore Foundation assets. The ballroom no longer felt like a place built for celebration. The crystal chandeliers still glowed overhead, casting warm gold light across marble floors and untouched wine glasses, but the illusion of perfection had vanished completely. Maya Brooks stood quietly near the center of the room, holding the ownership agreement with both hands while rain continued sliding down the massive windows behind her. 50%. Her father had built half of the Whitmore Foundation, and for 20 years the world had never known his name. Richard Whitmore looked smaller now somehow, despite the expensive tuxedo and towering ballroom around him. The billionaire stared at the document as though he could not bear seeing it exist outside the shadows anymore. Daniel wanted his share transferred to his family, Helen said softly beside Maya. If anything happened to him, the foundation legally belonged to them as much as Richard. Arthur lowered himself heavily into a chair, rubbing trembling fingers across his forehead. All these years, he whispered. Dear God. Maya looked around the ballroom slowly. The same guests who had ignored her earlier were now watching her with something completely different in their eyes. Not pity. Respect. A few looked ashamed. Others looked heartbroken. The younger hotel server who had draped the jacket over Maya's shoulders stood quietly near the wall now, tears shining in her eyes. Maya carefully folded the ownership papers and slipped them back inside the envelope with her father's letter. Her hands had finally stopped shaking, not because the pain was gone, but because the truth no longer belonged only to silence. Richard stepped toward her slowly. Maya, he said quietly. She looked at him without anger now. That surprised even her. Somewhere between the rain, the letters, and the truth finally spoken aloud, the fury she carried for years had turned into something heavier. Sadness. Richard swallowed hard before speaking again. I cannot undo what happened to your family. His voice sounded raw beneath the silence. I cannot undo the years your grandmother suffered, or what your mother went through believing Daniel abandoned her. Maya listened without interrupting. Richard glanced around the ballroom once before lowering his eyes. But everything your father built should have carried his name beside mine from the beginning. Nobody moved. Nobody reached for a phone or a drink. The room listened. Tomorrow morning, Richard continued quietly. The foundation board will receive my resignation. A stunned breath spread softly through the crowd. Richard barely seemed to notice. And every scholarship, every hospital wing, every community program funded by this foundation will be renamed for Daniel Brooks. Maya felt tears finally rise into her eyes again, but this time she did not hide them. Richard looked at her carefully. Your father was the best man I ever knew, he admitted softly. And I spent 20 years proving I was not. The rain outside softened gradually, fading into a gentle rhythm against the glass. Maya looked down at the envelope one final time before lifting her eyes toward Richard. My father believed people could still choose honesty after failure, she said quietly. That was the difference between guilt and redemption. Richard nodded once, unable to speak. Maya stepped past him slowly then, her black shoes soft against the marble floor. Nobody stopped her this time. Nobody ordered security to remove her. The guests parted quietly instead, creating space for her to walk toward the ballroom doors beneath the warm chandelier light. As Maya reached the entrance, she paused for only a second and looked back. Richard Whitmore remained standing alone near the center of the ballroom, surrounded by wealth, power, and silence so complete it almost felt sacred. For the first time in 20 years, the room no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the truth. Maya pulled the hotel jacket tighter around her shoulders and stepped out into the cool Manhattan night, while behind her the rain washed softly against the windows of the gala her father helped build long before anyone bothered learning his name.